Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining another of AM&P's webinar series. I am Thomas Marcetti, Associate Editor for AM&P's Signature Magazine. With it potentially being years until we can safely attend in-person conferences the way we did in the past, virtual and hybrid events are more important than ever and will likely only become more important. So today we're going to take a closer look at how one particular association took the leap from in-person to virtual. And guiding us through that today is Luann Sabatier, Principal of Sabatier Consulting. Luann, if you want to take it away.
Hi, Thomas. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. I'm glad you could join us. We have quite a bit of material to cover today. I do want to let you know that today's session will be archived on the AM&P website, and at the end of our hour together, I will share with you how immediately you can get a copy of the deck and some supporting articles. Before Bob's going to hang with me, here's the agenda for the hour, what we're going to do. Let me bring this up. So we're going to start with just some background and framing, and that's going to be about 15 to 20 minutes. Then Bob and I are going to have a conversation. It's actually a Q&A that's going to cover all the particulars, how he was put in a situation of his major annual event and how he flipped that virtual in less than a week. And there's a lot of learnings there. It's a great case study. Then we're going to open up for Q&A. A little bit of housekeeping. The chat box is enabled. If you want to put some questions in there anytime throughout the presentation, number one, they will be archived, but I will scroll through those, and Bob and I will both. We are going to leave about 10 or 15 minutes to answer questions. And last, if don't get through all the questions, we will somehow figure out how to respond to you. So without further ado, we thank AM&P for hosting this lunchtime webinar. Again, Bob Moore, my colleague and partner in crime, he is the Executive Director of American College of Osteopathic Family Physicians, and he has 20 years of association leadership and management experience. He is on the board of ASAE, and we'll come back to Bob shortly. I'm Principal of Sabatier Consulting. Session content, types of virtual events, the business considerations in hosting a virtual event, how to create it so it is attendee-eccentric, in other words, engaging, maximizing your sponsor opportunities, some virtual tools and technologies that are out there that you should be aware of, whether you use them or choose to use them. Some KPIs that are the standard or the floor for measuring success, and you, of course, can add to those. We'll have Bob's case studies, and then we'll go to the questions. Just from the 100,000-foot view, the types of virtual events, podcasts are even thrown in here. But when we talk about virtual events, we're not always just talking about an annual meeting. You can have online training and workshops. A lot of you, many of you are doing continuing education courses and classes, webinars, such as we're doing today, a virtual summit or conference, and then hybrid, which I'll come to in a minute, but that is when you are doing a face-to-face event live and you marry some type of virtual aspect to it. So activities, it's important to know in a virtual conference may take place in real time, on demand, or some combination of the two. Let me also say, many of you, we have some nonprofit participants today, and if you're doing business development or fundraising, virtual events can be under the summit conference or a webinar, so keep that in mind also. One of the things I wanted to mention about hybrid is that we will not be going back to, I don't think ever, or at least in the foreseeable future, to to strictly live or face-to-face. The reason being, once you have, number one, as the host of the meeting or the event, the virtual event, once you have figured out how to slay this dragon a little bit, as well as your audience and members, once they participate, I think you will see the advantage of adding this to your face-to-face, and certainly your members and attendees do. So I'll come to that in a moment. What are some business considerations? Even if you have to flip it quickly, or it's your first one, the type of event, as we just said, what is the purpose? The length of the event. Is this going to be a 1-hour webinar? Are we talking about a half-day seminar webinar? Is it a 1-day event? Is it a 3-day event? We actually, within the AM&P family, have had, or upcoming, several members who have 4- and 5-day events that they are flipping and pivoting to digital. It's important the content plan. Have some different considerations when you're virtual. Then you can certainly use your same approach when you're, as you do on your live or face-to-face events. But the considerations are it's harder to have multiple sessions going on at once. Yes, you can do Zoom breakout rooms and many of them, but the content plan should not just necessarily take what you were doing face-to-face and bring it online. There are just technology considerations, format considerations. So you just want to think through that. We're going to touch on in a minute the features and functionalities needed based on the type of event you are hosting, and then what's your revenue model. And by revenue model, let's begin by your virtual event budget. Costs usually depend on the complexity of the event, not always the number of attendees. Now, there are times where, yes, your platform or your license, so many people signing on, coming in, particularly with a license, software or partner, the number of attendees could impact the budget, but most often it's a complexity. The virtual conference model is evolving to be more distributed, more bite-sized, and more focused. Let me begin by saying this is not a rule of thumb, but what we have found and what I've spoken to many, many people who have been in virtual for a while, you can't match, or you usually will not match, the revenue that you generate on a face-to-face, even with your exhibit halls, your registrations, and so forth. Most likely, if you had that model in a live event, you would hope to recoup half to 2/3. Now, if you can do 100%, great, it's terrific. That would be your goal. So what do you do with that? What we've seen is when we talk about bite size, it's not the buffet model where you have 4 or 5 revenue streams and you get all your money in at once. You may have to take your offerings and offer them up, not only in a virtual event, but additional companion throughout the year, webinars or things virtually to complement. So it's smaller, more distributed virtual options over the year if you were trying to replace revenue that you had budgeted for in a face-to-face. Also, and so part of that, what would be in your revenue model? Obviously registrations, sponsorships, and advertising, the traditional ones. The good thing is your costs are usually much lower unless you are licensing one of the major vendors, which someone told me last week that they had a license for a client that it was astronomical. It was $150,000. This is someone who does several virtual events a year with exhibit halls. That is just not even, that's off the chart. That's 99% of you are not going to encounter that. So just know your costs are much lower, but your revenue is scaled back also. That said, even with lower revenue, we believe the margins can be very good, the percent margin better even than your face-to-face. So what I'm saying again is you should have less cost. You probably will have less revenue, but your margins should look better. The most important thing I can share with you is coming out of a virtual event is create an attendee-centric experience. And there are two key factors. There's multiple ways to do this, but providing a wide variety of engaging content, and that's a packed loaded sentence there. So you've got variety and engaging. Variety doesn't necessarily mean engaging. Variety means what it is, the topics, the themes, it could be tracks, and engaging means not only your presenters, are they skilled? Have they been trained to present virtually? And are you changing up your formats? And what I mean by that, everything can't and should not be pre-recorded. Are you doing pre-recorded with some live Q&A? Are you interjecting polls? I'll get to that in a minute. And then provide an outlet for attendees to engage with one another, so you're not always speaking at them. And I'm not just talking about a webinar or a pre-recorded where they can put questions in. You really want to give them multiple ways to engage with each other and the host, and ideally even the presenters. 2 slides, and again, you would want to maybe study these. These are not in a typical deck that someone will give you for a virtual event. I did not create this, but I did tailor it for you. For what you want to do is build the experience. So regardless, whether it's an hour, a day, 3 multiple day, from beginning to middle and end at the bottom, and then look, this is based on history and psychology and online learning models. All right, so you need to grab them. You want to make sure whatever in your marketing that you're gaining attention and excitement. One of the things I will say to you, it is highly recommended that you have a host or a moderator for the entire event, in addition to your president or your panel lead for each of the breakouts. Someone who's going to tie it all together, keep that, not just enthusiasm, but really the polish and professionalism. You're going to set the stage, prepare the audience. Preparing the audience is critical. Everybody doesn't know how to use Zoom. They may not even know what WebEx is, how to download, how to necessarily use mobile apps. So you cannot over communicate with your attendees. You want to make sure that you are setting the stage, not only in how you describe the virtual event, but how you're communicating with how they can join it. How can they interact with each other? So that was what I mean by preparing the audience. And then we're at the pinnacle at the top. The engagement is they're starting to join sessions or coming in and out. Let me go back to one thing about prepare the audience, and this is in the blog post I mentioned. You will even ask people at the beginning of sessions, would they please mind turning off their phone and their instant message in their email? We do this in person. We go to people and say, hey, please, can we turn your phone off? You need to understand that when they are in this meeting, they probably have 1 or 2 kids running around and a dog under their desk or somebody knocking at the door. All right, so that's okay. And so you just want to say that's fine, but whatever you can do to help keep them focused, or if they leave, to come back. So engaging, that basically comes to, and this is what you're all great at, this is what associations do, it's the glue that holds the membership together. You create content, you serve them, whatever the field is. And it's no different with this. It's just you have more pressure because there's more things competing to take them away from you. Even if they love you, there are things they're not there, they can't see you, your visual cues. So just know that aside from the length of the sessions, are you going too long or are you giving them away? There are multiple ways, and we go into this again in some of our backup material on how to engage them. Don't assume because they're a member of your association and that they signed up that they're going to come on and be engaged throughout the whole session. And then as we come down the trajectory here, do something surprising. Whether that's even, and this is not just about networking, a surprise birds of a feather hour at the end, which means birds of a feather. You have breakout groups based on either hobbies or interests. This sounds really silly, but we do this in face-to-face now. Even offer up at the end, anybody who wants to come back on at the end of our session today, we're going to do a free yoga session. You might say, what does that have to do with anything? It's fun for them, you know, so you're creating some memories aside from just the great content and what they're feeding on. And then extending, go the extra mile. Go the extra mile is, you know, make it easy for them to access your material almost immediately. I'm going to share with you that I think all of you should have someone appointed on your staff, on your team, or in your association whose job throughout the whole event, whether it's 1 hour or it's 3 days, is making sure that things are archived and handouts are there, because go the extra mile means they sometimes want that material right away. They need it. And so rather than wait to load it up. So let me continue. I won't spend too much time. You can look at this later if you look at the deck, but we have their attention, the amount of time, and then the value. And it's another way of framing it. The focus, that we want to move them from passive to being curious, to start to absorb the information. We want them to have a little fun. We want to make them commit that they come out, they're different. They're different because of what they learned, maybe someone they met, maybe how you inspired them. And then achievement. Is this a continuing credit? Is this something, and Bob will share about that in a minute, that is memorable? So again, I cannot overemphasize the importance of the engagement and focused on the learner or the attendee. We talked about, again, a little bit on the revenue side, virtual sponsorships and advertising's under that. I won't go into all of these right now, but there are multiple ways. Not only virtual gives you some new opportunities, for digital lead generation, collateral and handout distribution. You can even do something called digitalgoodiebag.com, to where even if you don't have an exhibit hall at the end or beginning of your conference, they can access a virtual goodie bag, which may have gift cards, discounts off your books, whatever you want in there. Sponsored content, multiple ways to do that. Streaming video, personalized recommendations, interest tags, sponsorships, what they're interested in, and someone can sponsor that track. Targeted ads, sponsored profiles. And one of the things that's really important is linked banner ads. So the banner ads actually are tied to more topics and themes. Sponsors that have been in the virtual space love it. And they will not be hard. The problem is most of ours have been live only. And so now some of them, many of them are pivoting at the same time with you. Keep that in mind. Bring them in as early as you can. Are you going to lose several if you're pivoting now? It depends, again, on the field and have they done it. But it doesn't have to be that way. We're finding even virtual exhibit halls are tremendous. And I myself in the last 2 weeks have demoed 3 or 4 vendors. I'm not endorsing them. One even on the former AM&P board member, GLC out of Chicago, has a new beta project out, a new virtual exhibit hall. So that's Joe Stella, many of you know him. There's a lot of opportunities out there. It's just the problem is we're moving quickly. We have to learn about this and to source vendors and opportunities is hard when you're also trying to sell sponsors on a new format, a lot of them. Okay, think about all now your virtual tools and technologies. Think of them in 3 buckets. You will have the webinar and webcast tools. And those are anything that help you deliver audio and video content. Then you have communication tools. That's a second bucket. And those can be anything, by the way. These are big buckets. Those help you interact. with your attendees, your subject matter experts, your exhibitors, and they range everything from text chat features that are in a lot of your web platforms like Zoom to integrated discussion boards, as well as your social media tools. Now, I'll talk about this in a minute. Some of you can patch these together, and I'm going to talk about if you have an LMS, you should probably use it or integrate in it. You don't have to go out and license a special particular exhibit platform or vendor. Some of you may want to. The challenge is sometimes with an LMS, if you're piecing them together, you just want to make sure everything can talk to each other and you can share data. And then document and resource sharing, that's your other bucket. So attendees can have information that complements and supports their presentations. I spoke of this before, I won't spend a lot of time on it, but the size and complexity of your event, think about the number of sessions, the attendees, speakers, that will impact the technology you use. So, again, we won't study this. I want to make sure that I leave a lot of time to speak with Bob, but you might want to even add podcasts to this. This is helpful. Even if you've done hundreds of virtual, it's helpful. There's always someone new on your team. So throughout the year, maybe you do all of these. And so based on this, these tend to be the features you needed. It's just like when you spec out a new print job, when you spec out a new job and you write a job description, when you're doing a virtual event, we're not simply talking about let's get it up on Zoom and let's go. The more you spec out your requirements and then look at what technology do we have and what's out there, if you have time to take a breath and do that, this kind of chart can be helpful. So, you know, it just covers, can we share presentations? Do we do polling? Do we want everyone to see each other or just see the presenters? How are we facilitating communication? Are we needing pre-recorded sessions? Are we going to sell things on top of registering? Many of you have iPoster presentations for professional experts. Is that part of this? Do we want to access vendor materials and exhibits? Do we want to matchmake and make appointments so they can do live? By the way, you can do live chats with some of your exhibitors, and some of the platforms have even artificial intelligence. So just like you would never go to a booth in an exhibit hall, and most likely when it's not populated, I hate those sometimes where you go virtual and it says, I'm not here, I can chat with you 3 hours from now. Forget about it. You've just lost that lead, most likely. So they even have that'll come on an artificial interact with them, and then you can follow up in person later. And then feedback surveys. So again, helpful for planning purposes. The reason I put this, there are several vendors out there who have a platform that can interact with your AMS or your LMS, and they have all of these. So they will give you a virtual conference portal, the website, the hub for your event. They tie in social engagement features. They build out your virtual trade show, and they give you ways to generate and collect that money. That may be right for or appropriate for 1 or 2 out of 10. Don't feel the need. One of the things that's important as I'm getting ready to cap off here, many of you are on the continuum. Some of you have never had a virtual event or hosted one. And then some of you have done a few, you pivoted quickly, and others are very sophisticated. Just know wherever you are on the continuum, it's just continually be learning from your own experience and your colleagues. That's more important than comparing yourself for the size or the platform. A study that just came out a month ago by Bizibo, they're very involved in event planners around the country for profit and nonprofit. Event marketers are looking for technology to support a hybrid event strategy. So let me get my 68% of those around the country are saying, I want a hybrid. I realize even virtual now, I will have virtual with my in-person going forward. 2/3 say the tools to engage my audience is critical, and you can read the rest of the, it's just kind of your peers and colleagues out there where they're at. It's not saying that you have to agree with it, but everything, all eyes are on virtual right now and hybrid. KPIs, those are key performance indicators, the key data. This is the basics. Some of you are going to want to collect several other things, but you really want to be data driven, and data becomes even more important for virtual because you don't have that personal interaction. So everything from your email open rates and click-throughs on your registrations and marketing, your social media impressions, whether that may be LinkedIn, Instagram, your Twitter, maybe you have a Facebook account, or Pinterest, the number of sessions attended, how many questions are asked in a virtual session lets you know if they're engaged, the number of network community check-ins, speaker views, if you have a virtual exhibit hall, what was the traffic, what were the interactions, how many appointments made, and then most importantly too, a follow-up survey. What did they like and what can be improved upon? And again, Bisabow, attendee engagement is the top KPI. So when we look at that, there were 80% that said the number one thing I wanted, it's not how many people show up, it's are they hanging with me, are they getting something out of it? Now I'd like to pivot and bring Bob in. As I do, let me show something to you because I'm going to turn off the seminar. In closing, it's really important to have a plan and the proper technologies in place because you all want to deliver an engaging, informative experience for your attendees. At the end of our presentation, there are two live links. One is an article which is how I found Bob. He wrote an article for ASAE on their website, how an association turned its major conference into a virtual event. And I have a 3,000 word blog with some links, hosting successful virtual and hybrid events. This presentation and those articles at the end of the session, they're available free of charge at sabatierconsulting.com. Click the blog button at the top and you can download it. So without further ado, let me go to Bob and welcome, Bob.
Hello, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever everyone is.
Let me say I did not know Bob prior, but all of you, I'm commiserating. When the pandemic hit, I figured that the industry was going to be jumping to virtual, and I was curious what was happening in the association world. And this was the end of March, and not much. And Bob showed up because he flipped it. So Bob, thank you. Can you share with us what's your background with hosting or participating in virtual events prior to March 2020?
Sure. As you noted, I've been in the association management space for over 20 years, and I started in the education space, so overseeing professional development departments. And so most of my experience has been around webinars a few associations ago and on-demand learning up to really just more recently. So it wasn't until this March that I actually was engaged with an actual virtual convention of that size and magnitude.
Okay, so share with us, how was COVID-19 and the uncertainty that it brought with it? How did it impact you and your association? What did you have on the books? And just take me, before we talk about the solutions you considered, take me through your panic mode, or maybe you didn't panic, it doesn't sound like it.
Well, there's a lot of stress, of course, just like everyone on the call I'm sure can commiserate with. But starting at the beginning of 2020, we started to see COVID occurring over in China and abroad and moving its way to the States. And so we were monitoring it closely. Our meeting was scheduled for New Orleans, the middle of March. And once we got toward the end of February, that first week of March, we have a lot of academic members, and their institutions started to implement travel bans. So that started to impact some of the speakers that we had scheduled for our event. So real quickly, I started talking with our education team about ways that we could patch them in so that they would be virtually presenting, so we didn't have to scramble and find new presenters. And I just started to suggest that we start thinking about a hybrid scenario at that point. But that was still only about 2 weeks, before the start of our meeting. But we at that point started looking at using Zoom, which is what we use for our regular meetings. So we started monitoring the situation. We were meeting with our board on a very regular basis at that point. And initially our board, being an osteopathic family medicine organization and being physicians, At that point, there was still a lot that was unknown about COVID, how big this was really going to be, parallels to other past situations with the flu, so on and so forth. And at that point, New Orleans and Louisiana as a state had not been touched by it. That part of the country was really pretty good. So the first board meeting we had, they voted to proceed with the meeting as planned. And that was March 3rd, I think 1st or 3rd, the very beginning of March. Actually, it was probably around the 6th because it was 3 days later than we met, and that was around March 8th or 9th. And they voted to change the decision and actually move to a 100% virtual event. It was because within that 3-day window, cases started occurring in Louisiana. That was approaching the St. Patrick's Day weekend, and they started putting limitations on the parades and large group events. So the writing was on the wall. New Orleans and Louisiana was quickly moving in the direction that we already saw in New York and other places that were starting to get hit. And in fact, New Orleans became quickly a hotspot. And we think it might have been partly because of some of the Mardi Gras activities in that 2-week window. So literally overnight, even though we were talking about it within a few weeks window, within 24, 48, 36 hours, our world really started changing very quickly when the board met and we decided that we were going to switch to a virtual event. And during that time, I was meeting with my team. We came into the office over one of the weekends in the beginning of March and we scenario planned and said, okay, of all the things that are going on with our event, what would this look like if we have to cancel or if we move virtual? What would our recommendations be to the board? So as we had these board meetings, we were prepared to help inform their dialogue and deliberation on what we should consider doing, given the short time frame that we were working in and the variables that we were faced with.
Let me ask you, thank you for that. And just to set the scene, because it's not a large team, is it? How many are on your team, real quickly, because I want to get to your solutions. So how big is the event when it's face-to-face, and how many are on your team?
Sure. So we have 16 staff plus myself. So, a relatively small, medium-sized staff. Small and mighty, as I like to say. In terms of the event, we hover usually around the upper 1800s, close to 2000. Unfortunately, for New Orleans, we were breaking records. We were trending well ahead. We already had exceeded 2000, and we usually pick up several hundred on site. So by all accounts, we were going to break records with this meeting this year in New Orleans. And I had just a kind of a sidebar. I had just started as executive director a year and a half ago. So this was my first full year planning this event. Wow. And so I was really excited for this to be my first annual convention. We were breaking records. We had some new team members in place. I mean, we were just all about positivity and excitement, and we had really good data and trends behind our back, and then COVID happened.
Okay, so when you pivoted, how did you communicate that to your members or attendees, and simultaneously, what solutions technology-wise were you looking at internally? What, you said Zoom, do you have an LMS? What did those two things look like, your external facing comms, while you're trying to pull this together in just a few days?
Sure. So as we met with the board, we actually started back in February with our communications. So as it started to ramp up within the States, we immediately went into a crisis communication mode because we saw that this could become something bigger. So I worked with the communications team and we created a COVID resource page. I'm not ashamed to steal great resources that exist out in the association space. And really quickly, there were some groups that much bigger than us had already made some headway on it. And we asked for permission to use some of them. They were very gracious. So that helped us get that up fairly quickly. And we started with our messaging to all of our members, to let them know this is on the top of our radar, and then to our attendees, letting them know this is a situation in which we're monitoring. Their safety is of utmost importance. We'll keep them apprised of any changes that we make to the event. So we kept those communications starting, and that was probably the middle of February, I would say, time-wise, when those first messages started going out. And those went out on a regular basis. And then when the board met for the first time, we communicated to the attendees, letting them know the board met, deliberated the situation at hand, and decided to proceed forward with the event. And then a few days later, went out with another message, and that went to all members, letting them know that the board, in light of the most recent changes that were moving in a not positive direction, made the weighty decision to transition this to a virtual environment.
Let me ask you something that I want to interject there. When you let them know that it will be all viral, but not viral, Virtual, yeah, viral. Had you already made your price point decision in that communication? Did you say, guess what? It's the same price, it's less, or did your pricing come slightly after? I mean, how did you communicate what they were going to be paying or what they could pay? Did you offer refunds?
Sure. So we, the initial message was we wanted it timely letting them know that we were switching to virtual, and we needed a little bit more time to get our registration system in place to talk about the price points. But within about a 24, 36-hour window after announcing the cancellation, we were ready to go with transitioning them with options. So we gave everyone 5 options as an attendee. You could either ask for a full refund, which we would honor. We would allow them to transition their registration to our virtual convention, and we gave them 25% off for that. They could donate it to our foundation. They could, trying to remember what the other two, they could pay forward to 21. If they said, you know what, it's not in the cards for me this year, but I'll have that as my registration for 21. So those were 4 of the big ones that we had, I think, to our auxiliary as well, which is another activity group that they could donate their registration toward. So overwhelmingly, people, over 50% transitioned to the virtual event. So of around the 2,000 that we had registered, that also includes exhibitors, some family, what have you. But of the actual physician attendees, about 50% transitioned over, which would have been about 750 individuals. The other half, the majority, I would say, asked for a refund, 40% asked for a refund. And then we had, I'd say about 10%, close to 10% asked to pay forward to next year. So in that communication, though, we did discount the pricing so that we would make it attractive. We wanted to get as many people to this event as possible.
What was your price point and how long was the event?
So our event started on Thursday and it goes through Sunday morning. So we had about 3.5 days of CME content. They were heavy and long days. Given the environment that we were in, it was locked down. So we had some luxuries that we were afforded, that people were a captive audience. At that point, they didn't have the Zoom fatigue. They were just excited.
They're physicians.
Right, they're physicians, and they just, a lot of them weren't able to even go into work. So ultimately, the discounted price that we had for members, we charged $750 for our members and $1,050 for non-members. And then if you're a first-year in practice physician and you're just starting out, finances are tough, so we only charge $350 with our online pricing. Retired $300, residents $225, and students were $75.
And did you have I want to get to your platform. Did you did or did not have a virtual exhibit hall?
We did not. So in our scenario planning, we had to ultimately make decisions on what we were going to pivot to and offer. And ultimately, when we gave all the aspects of our event, because it's big and there's a ton going on during it, the decision by the board was to only move forward with our one pre-conference, as a 2-day pre-conference session, and our 3.5-day CME core event. And that was our sole 100% focus for the 6 days. And we used Zoom, as I alluded to earlier, for our technology platform, because that's what we use for our committee meetings. It's technology that as staff we're fairly comfortable with. And what we chose to focus in on was really one track. So we really didn't need lots of complexities within a technology platform, which played into some of our decision and our ability to pivot as quickly as we did. We basically said, let's stick with the schedule that we had in place, because when we were weighing the pros and cons, for me, it almost seemed more heavy to actually wait and postpone the event, because it felt like having to now do the event from scratch, because you had to remarket, you had to reconfirm all your speakers, reconfigure timeframes. And we were that close. We had their schedules locked down. They were committed to doing it. We had the schedule. It was built into our mobile app. That's ultimately what we said, let's plow through and let's do this, And now I wouldn't suggest that now because the days were too long and it was probably not the best from an adult learning perspective. But like I said before, we had a captive audience and they were thrilled that we provided that opportunity. So we ended up using Zoom. We didn't hold a virtual trade show. We didn't do our Congress, which sets our governing policies for the organization. We didn't do our social events or awards. Those we all put on pause until we got through this. And then we started to consider how we were going to move forward with recognizing award winners, so on and so forth.
What was and I want to talk about that because the audience may or may not know, you have coming right up in August, another virtual event, and you've got a lot of learnings you want to incorporate. But what was your biggest fear? As you said, you know, you didn't want to postpone it, but as you looked at the risk, even as you're going forward, your reservations, your risk, or what was your biggest challenge?
Well, I think technology is always your biggest challenge. You know, will it hold up? You know, there was a lot that was riding on this. We even at ACOFP have we have a learning management system. To your question earlier, we use Blue Sky. So we had a track record of having on-demand learning, asynchronous learning. We had tried webinars; they kind of went by the wayside, and we hadn't yet started those again. So in terms of live virtual programming, that was somewhat new. And I just had hired a new director of knowledge and learning who came with that background because I wanted to focus in on e-learning. So thank goodness, time-wise, he started in September. So he was on board, and I would say A, technology, and then B, just the team's preparedness and comfort level with what we were about to approach. And that's why I was including them through all the conversations to gauge their comfort level. But we own our own building. Sometimes our internet's not the most stable. So I was concerned running a virtual meeting and the internet going out, or it breaking and suddenly we have a glitch. So we actually ended up renting one of those remote workspaces to go to that had dedicated high-speed internet that had a better confidence, at least for me, that we could go into a boardroom and set up really kind of like a war room, if you will, that the team that was involved in it, they all camped out there. The second part of it, in terms of the comfort level of the team, outside of my director of knowledge and learning, who had that background, myself, I could do webinars, and my director of finance. We were limited in terms of our team's ability to do anything e-learning related, and I knew he needed support. And while he, had this can-do spirit, I've got this, I said, you need help. And so we contracted with PSAV, our AV vendor, because we already owed them money anyways, with canceling it. And we brought a PSAV tech into our war room to be there to help him. And so we actually set up a virtual speaker room for the speakers to come in and test out their audio, them pulling up their own slides in Zoom. And that PSAV tech was able to walk through all of that with them to ensure that their comfort level was solid when they actually then logged into the main virtual meeting room. And that was a huge win for us. I think the team just felt much more comfortable having that expertise there. My director needed that. He was moderating sessions.
Let me ask you, I don't want to interrupt, but I don't want to lose it. So this was a vendor that you had contracted for the live event. Mm-hmm. And so whether they gave you the money or you used their expertise and they just pivoted and worked with you.
Yes, but we were working with a group in New Orleans. So it was the overall parent company.
Same company, but same
right.
company.
And so it's about who's your local person that has, experience with Zoom that can help us.
Okay. Let me ask you, Bob. So at the end of the day, two things. How did you measure, because I think you have some amazing stats on that. What was your success benchmarks? You've never done it before. And then before we start and move into our question mode here in a few minutes, you have an event coming up, a slightly smaller one. What have you learned and what are you going to do the same and change? So first of all, tell me, how did you measure success and what were those metrics?
Right. So given the fact that we pivoted in 6 days, we didn't go into it with preset metrics. So we were just kind of more in a much more passive approach, but we measured it in terms of the number of our attendees that actually registered. I will note that when we did pick up 250 people that were not coming to New Orleans, just within one message that went out to all members. So we took that as a major win, that we had 750 convert, and then we picked up another 250. So we had 1,000 people, which was basically half of those number of individuals that would have been in New Orleans. So we took that as a big win, given that short time frame. But we also monitored in terms of people actually in the sessions and their participation rate, like how long did they stay in the sessions. So we do room counts for our in-person meetings. So we had that data, and we actually beat all of those records, even though we had 50% the number of people that would have traditionally been on site.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
We actually beat the in-session room stats. So they stayed there, they were more engaged. In terms of like the last day on Sunday, people usually are, flying out, what have you. We didn't have to worry about that, conflict. And they were in our Sunday sessions at a level that we've never seen before. So that was another win. And then our overall evaluation scores we take a look at that we were able to benchmark based upon previous years. And those were the best I've ever seen in my career. We had around almost 4.6 on perceived quality of the event and around just about 4.5 on the overall experience. And for those of you who do big events, know it's hard to get anything above a 4, I found in all my past associations, just because the differing opinions when you deal with thousands of people, it's just really hard to get a really high number just because there's just so many different variables at play. Jokingly, one of my board members said, well, it's probably because they didn't have to complain about the room temperature or the food being served because they only had themselves to blame for that. So those were the metrics that we had.
Without asking what it was financially, can you just give me, without revealing anything, some kind of comparison? Did you take a hit? Were you able to soften it? What learnings from the budget or financially can you share that you're comfortable with without getting?
Sure. We're still digging out from this, even though it was in March, just with all the contracts and the negotiations, and we had an insurance policy. So I signed one that had communicable disease covered in December. So we will be financially whole because we had that policy in place, regardless of how this shakes out. So that's a good thing. So we didn't lose money. So at the end of the day, I can just safely say, hopefully we'll actually end up faring better. In particular, because we recorded all this content now. So now it's evergreen and we can have this as an on-demand product. So my hope is that we will actually fare better financially, with this.
Okay. And then I see we have a first question coming in. So let's wrap up. You have an event in August. Tell me about that. Not just still, I think the climate and the COVID is still with us, but you said, you would probably maybe for whatever reason do it virtual anyway right now. Share about that real quick in just a couple minutes, if you would, Bob.
Sure. Yeah, so this event's much smaller. We typically get around the low 200s that come to this. It's a much more targeted event. There is a lot of hands-on with it, but knowing the direction things were going and wanting more than 6 days, I was really working with the board to say we need to make this decision much sooner in the process if we're thinking we're going to go virtual. So we were able to make that decision a good 4-ish months out, which allowed us to really work on redesigning this event in a virtual capacity. So to the question that came in, I can weave this in. I referenced that the days, really felt too long because we started at 8 in the morning and it went really almost solidly through till 5:30 at the end of the day with very minimal breaks. At best, we had some 30-minute, maybe 3 30-minute breaks. And it was just some of our sessions themselves would go 2 solid hours. And that's just a long time frame to go. So with the event in August, we're going to have 45-minute sessions. So we're breaking them down. We're chunking the information on a smaller scale. We're inserting a larger number of breaks. Luann, to some of the points that you raised earlier, the fun factor. My board president showed up as Elvis in March and he sang a song. He created new lyrics.
Oh, I love that.
About sanitation and cleanliness in the era of COVID. And it was just a surprise hit. People absolutely loved it. Social media went wild on it. So we're much more intentional about that now in August. So we're going to do chair yoga. We've got some musicians that are going to play music between the breaks. So we're just wanting to have a lot more fun with it between that and leverage to some, strengths and some talents that exist within our membership between our breaks. So that's another thing that we're doing. And we're starting also later because we're mindful of the West Coast. So in terms of the days being too long, we're actually going to have our core programming starting later in the morning Central Time, still ending around that 5 o'clock time frame. But the morning is going to be a little bit more optional general sessions. And what we're doing with those is we're actually opening those up to the entire membership. So we're seeing this as an opportunity to entice people to this event, bring awareness to it, give it as a member benefit. So we're picking topics that have a general appeal, and we're going to allow anyone to do that. And so if you're on the West Coast and it's a little bit too early, it's one of those, it's a nice to have, but we're hoping to play this with a different angle to get broader reach. And probably the other biggest thing that we're experimenting with is we're actually spreading the content out over 2 weekends. So, when we pick a program date, it's like throwing a dart on a board. We hope that date's going to have the best appeal to a larger audience. Well, we figured, what if we had 2 darts on the board and you've got 2 opportunities to reach your audience? And as long as you can make one of the weekends, you'll have access to the recorded content on the other if you can't make it. And if you can make the live for both, great. But we've pared back the days so they're shorter. So even if it's on a weekend, you're only going to have almost half days really on.
I love that. I love that idea. I've seen that before. Bob, we've got some questions. Let's try to tackle them. We want to make this interactive. And again, I want to share with you, hopefully you're with us if you have to jump off. We will archive the questions and figure out a way through AM&P to try to answer them. And you can also access this presentation, which has a lot more information in the charts at sabatierconsulting.com. Deborah has 2 questions. Let me put them. I'm going to let Bob answer. And Bob, we have, okay, Bob, we're tag teaming here, babe. We've got 10 minutes. So our responses need, so we can open up for more questions, we need to keep them to about a minute, okay? If we can. Deborah says, I had a successful virtual annual meeting and now I need to run a one-day that needs to be all discussion and engagement. Can you talk more about integrated discussion boards and also breakout Zoom rooms? What can make a Zoom-based meeting interactive? And it seems to me a mobile app would be distracting for a virtual event, but useful for a hybrid. Do we both agree? So before we get to the mobile app, that's a fascinating question. Can you share, whether you did it or not, are you doing discussion boards and are you going to do breakout Zoom rooms and interactive? And I'll tag team with you. I'll let you go first.
Sure, we're actually switching away from Zoom for the summer meeting. We're going to experiment with a different platform. So actually, that's a good question. I don't know. We are breaking though into tracks. So where we had a big room before, we are making it smaller to help increase with the interactivity. I don't know if there's going to be subsets within that at this stage. We're still working on some of those details.
Okay, let me share that I have a lot of ideas in the blog post, but what can make the meeting interactive is even aside from the breakout rooms, is throughout the session a poll. So if a presenter or a panel is doing something, you can take an immediate poll about, are you doing this or whatever. You can also do a quick survey. You can do an interactive live survey, not do you like the event, but how many of you, matter of fact, I saw something, I was on a Zoom that had people from 14 countries last week, and I was fascinated. I don't know if you all know this software called Brainstorm. And Brainstorm brought up live a question, and as the Zoom was on, I was looking at Bob, you could see in the second screen, they posed a question, and as the attendees and panelists answered. So it was very friendly, and also it's archived and you can save it as an attendee. So a lot more things in our blog post, but what about an app, Bob? Would you use an app for a virtual event only or just a hybrid?
I'd suggest considering it for a virtual only. We did for our March meeting because we paid for it. It was already set up. It was integrated with our amidst, our database, so it was secure, and that's how they had access to their presentations, and we were able to push out alerts through it. The Zoom rooms then were in it for them to log in as they needed it. So I was a big advocate for it for our March meeting. Now, having said that, we don't typically have that in our budget for our smaller August meeting, so we're not doing it there, but definitely for the hybrid. But I would also encourage you considering it for a virtual only if it's a big meeting.
I agree. Do we have any other questions? I have some questions that I can ask, but if you do, just...
I was going to mention the polling, the interactivity piece. That was one thing that from our feedback, we found that the polls were hands down the most popular engagement feature of the sessions. We found that the discussion chat, for whatever reason, was not. And we're not sure if people's names and it was, feeling self-conscious about a question being perceived as not smart or whatever the case may be, but case-based discussions won the day. And fortunately, a lot of our sessions are designed that way because they're much more interactive. You engage the audience. Okay, we're at this part of the case. What are your thoughts with the poll? That kept people really watching the screen and engaged, but our responses to the polls were off the charts. They were really good.
Let me also add that something that we tend to, particularly academics, but a lot of nonprofits, they tend to have some disdain for gamification. It's huge. There are ways to integrate it into your content. So whether throughout the 2-day event or the 1-day event, it's different than a poll, but there are ways that you can structure a challenge using interactive games. And so that breaks it up, but it's still a different kind of learning. One of the other things when you talk about being interactive is what are you doing to incentivize them to share? In other words, aside, first of all, by the way, there are ways to be anonymous on chat, and I would highly encourage you to look at that and figure out maybe if you want to use that, to your point. But I will say this, some other research I saw, by the way, Deborah, when you talk about interactivity, that overall, across the board, the research that Forrester has done, and I talk about that in the blog, that the engagement is much higher, regardless of the field, for a virtual event. That said, I want to make sure that we all understand face-to-face, nothing can beat it. And so we're not doing Pollyanna here. But even if you go back, I think ultimately to face-to-face, you don't want to pivot back and forget all the virtual learnings. Bob's point alone, 250 people came on who wouldn't go or couldn't have gone for whatever reason. So if you really want to serve, whether it's different segments of your field, geography, different strata of the continuum, virtual is there. Bob, I want to ask you something. How are they accessing this content later? Are you archiving it all? How are you capturing it and using, is that content going to be evergreen? And will you try to offer it up for a fee to members who did not attend?
Yeah, so that was one of our high priorities after the meeting, as those sessions got recorded, to get them available through our LMS, and that's where they're housed. So we do have the post-meeting package. So you can access the entire virtual conference for its own separate fee if you never came, and we're getting people to do that. And we're working with our state chapters to offer that as a discount. So they're seeing that as a member benefit, and that's another marketing arm that we have to get this out to an audience that might not have otherwise been coming to our meetings. So it looks like they're offering something at the local level as well. So that's another new strategy that we're testing out, but for sure, that's helping build up our library significantly. And then we can pick and choose different topics. And if we want to have our own workshop on 5 or 6 topics, we might be able to pull from some of that recorded content from March and other places and now aggregate it in a new and different way.
Okay. I don't see, do we have any other questions coming in? Let me ask you this. What does hybrid look like for you then? So you're still doing virtual in the fall. So whenever it comes back, what does hybrid look like for you, Bob?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. That's what we're in the middle of right now, planning for our March meeting next year. And we're planning it with a hybrid in mind. God willing, that a vaccine happens and we can have our meeting in March 21 work. On person, we have longer days because you're paying for a hotel room. It's costly to be away from your office. So we need to still have fairly long days. And for whatever reason, we power through when we're on site. But that's not going to work in that virtual capacity. So we're looking at now staggering the content based upon time zones and looking at it being a virtual meeting, but a different virtual meeting of sorts, so that we can either justify different price points, but also lean into the experience. So if we'll offer things maybe on demand that are earlier in the day, so it'll be available as part of that virtual package. But for the live virtual, we're gonna be very selective in terms of the timing of those sessions that we think will have the broadest appeal. And when do we put that into our in-person live event so that it translates over both medium? That's probably the biggest thing that we're trying to spend time right now thinking about. We're also looking at now making more tracks where we traditionally have had one big room. We're thinking about now segmenting our content in different ways on site to help lend ourselves to the virtual environment. So it goes both ways. Our in-person event is going to look and feel very different as well. But then in reverse, it's going to feel different for those that did their virtual event this March to next March, because it's not going to be the exact same thing. The other piece
Go ahead. I have a question though, and I know it pertains to a lot of people. It's something you touched on early on, and we're at 12:59. We're going to sign off at 1. But let me just ask you. You said hands-on. I know former client of mine. They're teachers, and they come and the highlight of the live event is the interactive, and some of them it's learning how to do things. How do you handle that virtual, if at all, and once have you tackled that, figured it out yet?
So we're doing a little bit in August with that, because that event was very hands-on. Osteopathic medicine involves manipulation. We do a lot of hands-on workshops. fortunately, we have a video library. We record a lot of these techniques. So we're now starting to infuse our video library. We have 150 video clips that are demonstration based that we also sell on a subscription.